What's going on, guys? And welcome to our final part of our GCSE Paper 1 content. We're looking at research methods. We're going to start off by looking at designing research. So what is a hypothesis? Let's have a look. So a quick definition of hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable statement predicting a relationship between two or more variables. Hypotheses are used in experiments to guide research and focus data collection. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's a variable? Don't worry, we're going to go into that. So let's look at some of the characteristics of what we can say is a good hypothesis. 1, it needs to be testable. So it can be supported or refuted through experiments and experimental designs. It needs to be specific, meaning that it clearly defines what the variables are and any expected outcomes. It needs to be simple, so you need to avoid any unnecessary complexity or levels of ambiguity. So what are the different types of hypothesis? Well, you've got a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. So a null hypothesis, or H0, assumes that there is no relationship or effect. For example, there is no significant difference between two groups. The alternative hypothesis, or H1, predicts a relationship or effect between those variables. For example, there is a significant difference between the two groups. Let's look at an example of what this might be. So for example, our null hypothesis may be sleep deprivation has no effect on memory recall, whereas our alternative hypothesis will posit that sleep deprivation negatively affects memory recall. So the null hypothesis is that there is no relationship, and the alternative hypothesis is that there is a relationship. So what are the types of variables? Well, let's first off understand what a variable is. So a variable is anything that can change within an investigation. There are two key types of variable: the independent variable, or the IV, and the dependent variable, or DV. You need to be able to operationalize your variables, and that just basically means defining how variables will be measured. For example, hours of sleep is measured as the total hours of uninterrupted sleep. The whole purpose is that we establish cause and effect. So in an experiment, the only thing that should cause change to the dependent variable is the independent variable. Anything else should be controlled or completely removed. So what are the different types of variable? You heard us mention previously independent and dependent variable, but what are they? So your independent variable, or IV, is the variable that is manipulated by you or by the researcher, for example, hours of sleep. The dependent variable, or the DV, is the variable measured to assess the effect of the independent variable. Right? And a way to remember it is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. We've also got something called extraneous variables. And extraneous variables are variables other than the independent variable that could influence the dependent variable if not controlled. That could be anything like a noisy room next door to the test, or the temperature of the room during testing. We also have confounding variables, and these are variables that systematically vary with the independent variable and may provide an alternative explanation for results. That could be something like the participant's age. What about formulating a testable hypothesis? Well, there are steps that we need to take to formulate a hypothesis. So let's have a look at what they are now. We need to identify a research question. So an example of that might be, what is the effect of caffeine on reaction time? We need to determine the independent and the dependent variable. We need to write a null and an alternative hypothesis. Remember, we just looked at what those were. There are some common errors that people often make when starting out conducting research, and let's think of some of those and see what those errors are and how to avoid them. Ambiguity, you mentioned this previously. For example, children are better learners. That's completely unclear. You need to specify what better is. For example, children score higher on memory tests. Now that's more specific. Lack of testability. So avoid subjective or abstract hypotheses. For example, happiness is more fulfilling in urban areas. Experimental research designs. So we've got different types of designs of experiments. Let's have a look at what some of those are now. We've got laboratory experiments. What is the definition of this? So these are controlled environments where variables are manipulated. The strength of using a laboratory experiment is that you have high control over variables and the ability to easily establish causality. Weakness of this is that it's an artificial setting and potentially lacks ecological validity. Now, ecological validity is all about how well it represents what happens in real life. An example of this could be Milgram's obedience experiment from 1963. A field experiment. Now, field experiments are conducted in a natural setting. Researchers change the independent variable to see the effect on the dependent variable. Strength of this method is that it has a higher level of ecological validity, much more so than laboratory experiments. Weakness of this method is that we have less control over the variables themselves, and there's a potential for issues when it comes to ethics. Natural experiments. And with natural experiments, the researcher takes advantage of naturally occurring events, very similar to field experiments. However, the independent variable is not manipulated. Strengths of this method is that it has a high level of ecological validity, so it kind of represents the real world. There are also ethical benefits when manipulation isn't possible. So there might be certain circumstances, for example, if you're observing the impact of a terminal illness, for example, that isn't a type of variable that you would be able to manipulate ethically. So you may have the opportunity to just observe. Weaknesses: lack of control over variables and potential confounding factors that may impact the results. Questionnaires. Now, these are a written set of questions, and these are used to gather self-report data. You've got different types of questions when looking at questionnaires. You've got open-ended questions and close-ended questions. Now, close-ended questions require yes or no responses, whereas open-ended questions allow for the participants to elaborate. The strengths of this method is that you can gather large amounts of data very quickly. Weakness is that they're subject to bias, such as social desirability bias. And social desirability bias is when people respond in a way that they believe would make them seem more appealing to whoever it is that is reading the results. Interviews. Now, this is a face-to-face data collection method. You've got different types of interviews. You've got structured, which follows a very specific set of questions, semi-structured, which may have overarching themes, and unstructured, which is more like a discussion. Strengths is that this can provide detailed qualitative data. Weaknesses is that this can be a very time-consuming method. Also, the interviewer may have their own bias when asking the questions. Observations. Systematic observation and recording of behavior. There are different types. You've got naturalistic versus controlled. You've also got overt versus covert observations. So in this regard, covert observation is when the presence of the researcher isn't known, whereas overt it is. Strengths. It's useful for studying behavior in natural contexts, so seeing how people behave in natural settings. Weaknesses. Observer bias is one major weakness of this method. In essence, people see what they want to see. They will see things that may strengthen or support the hypothesis that they're putting forward. Also, difficulty in replicating naturalistic observations. It's going to be very difficult to completely replicate what has been observed, therefore reducing the level of generalizability. Case studies. Case study designs in psychology involves an in-depth, often long-term investigation of a single individual, small group, or unique situation. It typically uses multiple sources of evidence, such as interviews, observations, tests, and existing records to build a rich, detailed understanding of behavior, experiences, or psychological processes. The strengths of this method is that you can obtain rich, holistic data. It provides detailed insights that broader methods may miss, especially for rare or complex conditions. It's useful for theory development and can generate new hypotheses and deepen understanding of unusual phenomena. There are flexible methods and allows researchers to combine qualitative and quantitative data, all while displaying real-world relevance. These are often conducted in natural settings, increasing ecological validity also. Weaknesses. There's limited generalizability. Findings from one case or small sample cannot reliably be applied to wider populations. There's a massive risk of researcher bias, which is another weakness. Close involvement with participants may influence interpretation of that data. Again, drawing back to the researcher bias. These studies are also very difficult to replicate. Unique circumstances make it hard for researchers to repeat the study. There are also potential ethical issues to consider. Sensitive personal data and long-term involvement require careful handling. Now let's have a look at some different types of experimental designs. Independent group design, or between subjects design. Now in an independent group design, different participants are used in each condition of the experiment. For example, group A gets treatment X, while group B gets treatment Y. So strengths of this method is that we don't have order effects. So the participants, they don't get tired or practice from repeating the test over and over again. There's less chance of demand characteristics. In essence, participants are less likely to guess the study's purpose and adjust their responses in line with that. Weaknesses, participant variables. So there are differences between each member of the groups, and this may affect the results. Another weakness is that you need to collect a much larger sample. So you need more participants, in essence double than if you were going to repeat it. So more participants are required to achieve equal power. Repeated measures design, or within subjects. In this type of design, in the repeated measures design, the same participants take part in all conditions of the experiment. So for example, each participant experiences both treatment X and treatment Y. The strengths of this method is that participant variables are controlled. Same individuals are used across all conditions. Fewer participants are needed, so it's more efficient and more cost effective. Weaknesses of this method? Well, order effect is one. Participants might become tired, they may become bored, or practice may influence the results. Demand characteristics, again, participants may figure out the overall aim of the study and adjust their responses in line with that. Matched pairs design. So in the matched pairs design, participants are matched in pairs based on key characteristics, for example, things like their age, their IQ scores. One member of each pair is placed in different conditions of the experiment. The strengths of this method is that it reduces participant variables, so matching improves comparability between the groups. There's also no order effects, so each participant does only one condition of the experiment. Weaknesses of this method, again, is that it's time consuming. Finding suitable matches takes effort. Unfortunately, it can never be perfect. Matching can't control all participant differences. Understanding and controlling variables. So controlling extraneous variables. You can use random assignments to distribute them evenly across the groups. You can hold variables constant where possible, for example, testing all participants in the same room. Addressing confounding variables. Carefully design your experiments to isolate the independent variable. Use counterbalancing in repeated measures designs to avoid order effects. Examples of poor control, things like a hypothesis might be online learning improves academic performance. An uncontrolled confound could be socioeconomic status, which may influence access to those resources. So not everybody may be able to afford access to the internet or access to online. Alright guys, hopefully that gives you a better understanding of variables and kind of research methods. Take your time, look over the video again, just to make sure that you guys get a good understanding of each part. Catch you guys in the next one. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Peace.